They say the swamp remembers what men forget. Deep in the heart of Louisiana, where the river runs black and the air never cools, there's a field no one dares to cross. The ground there stays warm, even in winter, and when the night grows still, laughter drifts across the dark, soft at first, then rising until it feels like the earth itself is laughing back. Some say it's the ghosts of the enslaved, reclaiming what was stolen. Others say it's the land speaking through the man who woke it, an old blacksmith named Virgil, whose hammer rang loud enough to make the soil remember. Wherever you're listening from tonight, drop your city in the comments, because this story travels far. This is the tale of Jonas Calhoun, the man who bought the oldest slave in Louisiana, and the night Cypress Hollow finally answered back. The year was 1851, and the air above Fairwater Parish shimmered like glass, thick with humidity and the bitter smell of tobacco and river mud. Along the waterfront, where flatboats creaked against the docks, the auction yard throbbed with life and cruelty. Men in cream coats wiped their brows with embroidered handkerchiefs while pretending not to hear the cries from the holding pens behind them. The sun carved sharp shadows across the crowd, and every plank beneath their boots had absorbed the sweat and blood of 100 sales before this one. It was another Saturday in Louisiana, and business was good. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip as he called out prices, his words sharp and rhythmic. Young men went first, broad shoulders, calloused hands, teeth inspected like horses. The bidders called numbers without emotion, their gestures small, efficient, as if buying sacks of grain. One by one, the strong and the young were led away, leaving behind only the remnants of human labor the market no longer wanted. And then there was one. An old man, gray and frail, stood at the edge of the platform. His back was bent, his wrists thin as reeds, his face carved with the deep lines of long survival. He wore the look of someone who had seen every cruelty this place could invent and outlived them all. The auctioneer hesitated before calling his lot, almost apologetic for wasting the crowd's time. The planters laughed, tossing out jokes about buying bones for fertilizer. That was when the laughter broke. A man near the back of the yard raised his hand. He wore a dark coat, unfashionable, and dusted with travel. His voice was low but steady as he said he would buy the old man for $1. The crowd erupted in laughter again, louder this time. Some slapped each other's shoulders, others shouted for the auctioneer to let the fool have him. $1 for a walking corpse, they said. $1 for a ghost. But when the buyer stepped forward, the laughter softened. His name was Jonas Calhoun, a quiet man from the marshlands near Cypress Hollow. He met no one's gaze and spoke only once to confirm the sale. As he placed a single silver coin in the auctioneer's palm, the old man lifted his head. His eyes were pale, almost colorless. But when they found Calhoun, something flickered their recognition, or warning. For a moment, the noise of the auction yard seemed to fade. The wind fell still. A few of the planters glanced uneasily at one another, unsure why their amusement had soured into silence. The old man turned his face toward the river, the current whispering against the shore like a voice too old to forget. No one knew it then, but that single purchase, that single laugh, had awakened something in Fairwater Parish that would not sleep again. His name was Virgil. That was all anyone ever called him, and perhaps all he had ever needed. The name carried the weight of years, spoken in a voice that seemed to remember more than the living could bear. He arrived at Calhoun Manor in silence, seated in the back of a creaking wagon with his wrists resting on his knees and his head bowed low. The journey from Fairwater had taken only 2 hours, yet it felt as though the old man had crossed centuries. His skin was the color of river mud and smoke, his hair a tangled crown of white. When he moved, his joints cracked like cooling iron, a reminder of what he once was, a blacksmith, long ago, in a world that had burned hotter and punished slower. No one at the plantation believed he could have been what he claimed. They whispered that his eyes were too clouded to have ever seen a forge, and that his hands, scarred and crooked, could barely hold a hammer. But there were others, the older ones, who saw something different in him. They watched the way he studied the ground before stepping on it, as if measuring the land's memory. They saw how he touched the walls of the quarters when he entered, fingers tracing invisible patterns into the wood. To them, Virgil was not a man brought to work. He was a man brought to remind. Stories began to spread before the first sunset. Some said he had outlived every master he'd ever served, buried them all one by one, and never seemed to age. Others whispered that he'd been a ship's blacksmith on the Middle Passage, forging chains for captives before turning the fire on his captains. A few swore he had been alive since Africa itself had a name, that he was a spirit who refused to die until the earth returned what it had taken. Whether they believed it or not, everyone agreed on one thing when Virgil spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop and listen. Jonas Calhoun had brought him to Cypress Hollow for reasons no one understood. The overseer muttered that a man who bought a relic could only be chasing ghosts. But Jonas insisted that Virgil stay close to the house, not in the fields, not among the others. That decision unsettled everyone. It was unnatural to see a slave treated like a guest, moving freely through the yard, staring at the river as though waiting for something to rise from it. At night, from the quarters, the workers could hear him humming low, rhythmic, metallic. It was not a song but a pattern, the echo of hammer and anvil, of sparks that had long since died. The sound carried through the swamp, mingling with the cries of frogs and the sigh of the cypress branches. By the third night, even the overseer began to hear it in his dreams. Virgil never smiled, never complained, never asked for food or favor. Yet wherever he stood, the air thickened, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And though no one could explain why, everyone at Cypress Hollow began to feel that something had changed since his arrival. The nights grew longer. The river moved slower. The laughter that had once filled the manor's porch began to fade. It was as if the old man had carried the weight of forgotten souls with him, and Fairwater Parish, for the first time in living memory, had started to listen. Word of Jonas Calhoun's purchase spread through Fairwater Parish, faster than the river could carry rumor. By the following week, every veranda, every tavern, and every plantation porch between Baton Rouge and the Amite swamps was humming with laughter. They said Calhoun had lost his mind in the heat, that he'd wasted $1 on a man the grave had already claimed. Some claimed they saw the old slave walking beside the wagon like a shadow, not touching the ground. Others said he coughed like a dying mule and would not last a month. But what everyone agreed upon was that Calhoun had made a fool of himself, and nothing delighted planters more than watching another man's pride turn to spectacle. At the Fairwater Gentlemen's Hall that Saturday evening, the laughter turned into something louder and more dangerous. There, beneath the haze of cigar smoke and bourbon, the talk of Calhoun's ancient prize became a wager. The rules were simple, as all cruel games are. If the old man lived to see the next harvest, Calhoun would receive a thoroughbred stallion from the Braithwaite estate, a creature worth more than some men's land. But if the old man died before the harvest moon, Calhoun would forfeit half his cane yield to the rest of them. A year's work traded on the life of a man whose ribs showed through his shirt. They signed the wager with the flourish of gentlemen who thought they owned time itself. The men laughed as they sealed the deal, raising their glasses as if blessing a comedy. None of them believed the old man would last the season. How could he, with his trembling hands and his faraway stare? He was already half a ghost to them. Yet when they spoke of him, their voices dropped slightly, as though they feared he might somehow hear them from across the fields. Even laughter has its edges, and that night the edges were sharp. Jonas Calhoun did not attend the gathering. He remained at Cypress Hollow, walking the dark verandas of his estate, listening to the cicadas sing in waves. The wager did not reach his ears until days later, but by then it had already taken root. Every visitor who came to call mentioned it with a smirk, as though the whole parish shared a private joke at his expense. Calhoun offered no reply. Those who looked closely thought he seemed less offended than distant, as if he understood something they did not. The season moved forward. The air grew heavy with the smell of wet soil and burnt cane. The workers spoke in whispers, their eyes turning toward the old man who now spent long hours by the forge that no one had used in years. Each strike of his hammer echoed through the plantation like a slow heartbeat. The laughter that had started the wager began to fade with every note of that sound. The men who had mocked him forgot that the land remembers such arrogance, that every jest has a price. Fairwater Parish had always been a place where power spoke loud, but this time power had laughed too soon. Cypress Hollow sat at the edge of the known world, where the river bent like a serpent and the land gave way to swamp. Calhoun Manor rose from that misted wilderness like a memory the earth wanted to forget. The main house was grand in design but weary in soul, its columns stained by humidity, its windows clouded by years of smoke from cane fires. Around it stretched the endless fields, dark, fertile, and heavy with the scent of sugar, mud, and decay. The air never seemed to move there. Even the birds sang softer, as though afraid to disturb whatever slept beneath the soil. When Jonas Calhoun returned from Fairwater, the wagon wheels dragged grooves through the wet road. The workers gathered quietly to see the new arrival. What they saw made them uneasy. The old man climbed down slowly, his body frail yet his movements deliberate. He stood at the edge of the yard, shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth, and whispered something too low to catch. The others said it sounded like a greeting or a warning. Then, before taking a single step forward, he pressed his hand to the ground as if asking permission from it. A breeze moved through the cane at that exact moment, though the air had been still all morning. Life at Calhoun Manor had always followed a rhythm. Sunrise, work, sunset, silence. But that rhythm faltered with Virgil's arrival. The enslaved workers avoided crossing his path. Some claimed his shadow moved differently from his body. Others swore the dogs refused to bark when he passed. The overseer, Thaddeus Pike, called it nonsense and threatened to beat anyone caught spreading tales. Yet even he began to quicken his pace near the quarters after dark. The swamp had always been thick with sound frogs, cicadas, the creak of trees, but now, in the hours after midnight, it grew so quiet that men woke from sleep thinking something had stopped breathing. Jonas had no explanation for the unease that settled over his land. He told himself it was superstition, the same kind that made men whisper about ghosts in the river fog. But he noticed things too. The cane nearest the old man's cabin grew taller, greener, while the sections farther away yellowed as if drained. The air around Virgil's dwelling carried the faint scent of iron, like blood warming in sunlight. At night, when the house fell silent, Jonas could sometimes hear a deep hum rolling up from the ground, steady, pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. He convinced himself it was the wind shifting through the swamp, though the wind never reached Cypress Hollow. The workers said the land had remembered him, that the soil itself recognized the weight of his steps. They whispered that Virgil was not here to labor but to listen, that he could hear the dead beneath the fields. No one dared say these things aloud in daylight. But when the lanterns were extinguished and the frogs began their slow morning song, every soul on the plantation felt the same thought pressing against their chest, that something ancient had returned to Cypress Hollow, and that it had come to collect what was owed. Thaddeus Pike ruled Calhoun Manor with the brittle authority of a man who had never earned his power, only borrowed it from fear. He was tall and sunburned, his face carved by drink and rage, and his whip hung from his belt like an extension of his arm. The people of Cypress Hollow had long learned that Pike's moods were as dangerous as the weather, sudden, merciless, and impossible to predict. When the old man named Virgil arrived, something in Pike turned sour, as if the air itself had shifted against him. Virgil's quietness unsettled him. The old man spoke little, ate less, and worked not at all. Pike watched him from a distance, expecting to see weakness or guilt, but saw only stillness. It was a kind of defiance the overseer didn't understand, the kind that made him feel smaller in his own shadow. The workers kept their heads down, careful not to speak Virgil's name near Pike. They could feel the storm gathering behind his silence. Every morning Pike inspected the fields, barking orders to men and women bent double in the cane rows. He found comfort in control, in the sound of the whip slicing through air. But when he reached the far edge of the property, where Virgil sat beneath a dead pecan tree, humming softly to the ground, Pike's authority began to feel like paper in the rain. He shouted once, twice, but the old man never looked up. That was the first time anyone ever saw Thaddeus Pike hesitate. Jonas Calhoun's patience with Pike was already thinning. He had given strict orders that Virgil was not to be touched. When Pike demanded to know why, Jonas replied with a calmness that chilled him. The old man was not here to work, but to remember. Pike did not ask what that meant. He did not have to. Deep down, some part of him already knew that remembrance was more dangerous than rebellion. By late summer, the overseer's temper had begun to rot. Tools went missing. The hounds refused to track scent near the quarters. Pike started drinking before noon, muttering that the fields had gone wrong, that the soil felt strange beneath his boots. Workers whispered that he dreamed of the old man at night, standing at the foot of his bed, eyes wide open, mouth moving without sound. The tension broke one morning when Pike found a pattern carved into the soil behind the smokehouse, a circle marked with ash and river stones. The earth darkened as if it had bled. He wiped it away with his boot, but the mark reappeared the next day, larger, clearer, pulsing faintly beneath the sun. He cursed Virgil's name, though he never dared confront him again. That evening, as the fog rolled in from the swamp, Pike swore he heard his own whip cracking from somewhere deep within the cane, though no one was there to hold it. The sound came again the next night, and the next, until even he stopped venturing into the fields after dark. Those who worked under him began to notice that the overseer no longer shouted, no longer laughed. He had become quiet, hollow-eyed, and easily startled, like a man waiting for something to return. In the silence that followed, Calhoun Manor felt heavier, as if the air itself was watching. The workers avoided the overseer, and the overseer avoided the old man. Somewhere in that uneasy stillness, the balance of power began to tilt, though no one yet understood toward what. The first night in Cypress Hollow was heavy with the kind of darkness that felt alive. The air clung to skin like wet linen, and the sky pressed low, swollen with thunder that never quite broke. The swamp behind Calhoun Manor breathed in slow, rasping sighs, its waters glinting with faint reflections of lightning too far away to touch. It was a night that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to arrive or awaken. Inside the quarters, whispers drifted through the thin walls. The enslaved men and women huddled close to their lanterns, speaking in low tones about the sound that moved through the cane fields. Some said it was the wind. Others swore it was the voices of the dead, calling each name in turn, stretching the syllables until they disappeared into the swamp. The children cried softly until their mothers shushed them, covering their ears, afraid the voices might hear and answer back. Virgil did not sleep. He sat alone outside his cabin, a small lantern beside him, its flame barely strong enough to survive the air's damp weight. His hands were buried in the soil up to his wrists, fingers trembling as though feeling for something beneath the surface. The earth around him was darker than the rest of the yard, rich and wet, the kind that swallowed footprints whole. Every now and then he would hum a deep, wordless tune that rolled low in his chest like a forge's breath. It wasn't a melody anyone recognized, not a song from the fields or the hymns sung on Sunday mornings. It was older, heavier, carrying with it the rhythm of hammer against iron, of chains cooling in water, of something that had learned pain so long ago it no longer needed words. The dogs that patrolled the yard stopped near the cabin, hackles raised. They didn't bark. They only stared, tails pressed tight between their legs, ears twitching to a sound no human could hear. Then, as if struck by a single thought, they turned and bolted toward the stables, whining, refusing to come out again that night. From his room in the main house, Jonas Calhoun lay awake, listening. He could hear the hum faintly through the walls, deep and rhythmic, a pulse in the night. It seemed to merge with the thunder, as if the sky itself answered the old man's voice. For a moment, he considered ordering Pike to silence it, but something in that sound rooted him where he lay. It was not defiance he heard, it was remembrance. Around midnight, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet iron and burned sugar. The lantern in Virgil's cabin flickered out, but the humming continued. The ground began to tremble softly, the vibration spreading through the earth, through the cane fields, through the walls of the house. The workers who woke felt it in their chests before they heard it, an unseen heartbeat pulsing beneath their beds. By dawn, the air was still again, but the earth bore marks where Virgil's hands had been. The soil there was scorched black, dry in a place that had never known dryness. No one spoke of it when the sun rose. The overseer looked once, muttered a curse, and ordered the ground covered. But as the day went on, every worker who passed that patch of earth swore they could still hear it, faint and steady, the echo of a hum that refused to die. That morning, the swamp mist clung thicker than before. The river ran slower, as though something vast beneath its surface had begun to stir. And though no one dared to say it aloud, every soul in Cypress Hollow knew that the night had changed the land forever. Before Cypress Hollow, before the whispering fields and the still nights, there had been Charleston. In the flickering light of the forge, Virgil's world had been built from fire and iron. The air there had always smelled of salt and soot, thick with the cries of gulls and the crackle of burning coal. He had been younger then, though age mattered little when life was measured by pain. His hands were strong and steady, blackened by soot, his arms marked with burns that healed and reopened until scar became skin. Every day he stood before the anvil, shaping metal into instruments meant to break men. The forge belonged to a man named Halberd, a merchant who trafficked in more than sugar and cotton. His wealth came from the trade of bodies. Virgil had been forced to make shackles, wrist irons, ankle clamps, collars meant to keep people silent. Each spark that flew from his hammer landed on skin that no longer flinched. The sound of hammer on metal became a heartbeat, steady and cruel. He learned to listen to it the way others listened to the sea, knowing that each strike marked another life about to be weighed and sold. But even in chains, something inside him refused to cool. Late at night, when the overseer's boots faded down the path, Virgil worked by the faint glow of dying embers. He would take the scraps of iron left from the day's labor and melt them again, reshaping the remnants of bondage into something else: blades, hooks, edges sharp enough to cut through the lies that bound his people. They were small at first, hidden beneath the floorboards or buried beneath the sand near the docks. Each one carried a memory, a promise that pain could become resistance. When the rebellion in the Low Country failed, the search began. The knives were found, and so was the man who made them. Virgil was dragged into the square at dawn. They branded him on the shoulder with the mark of treason, the iron sizzling against his flesh until the air filled with the smell of cooked skin. He did not scream. He watched the faces of those who had turned away and memorized each one: their eyes, their silence, the way their fear looked too much like obedience. Afterward, they sold him south, to Louisiana, to a place that swallowed men whole. Yet the fire never left him. Even when his sight began to fade, he could still see the glow of the forge behind his eyelids, still hear the hiss of molten metal turning to form. He carried those sounds with him across the years, across the rivers, across the endless fields that became his prison. Now, in Cypress Hollow, when the wind passed over the cane and the soil shifted beneath his feet, he would whisper the names of those who had fallen, names no one else remembered, names that were never written in ledgers or carved into stone. He spoke them into the earth because he believed the ground listened, that it drank their sorrow and held their stories like seeds waiting to bloom. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, he would feel the air move differently, like a breath drawn from below. In those moments, he knew the earth was answering back. It did not use words. It spoke through the way the river hesitated, through the way the dogs whimpered, through the heaviness in the air when thunder rolled over the swamp. Virgil understood it. The world did not forget what it buried. It only waited for someone brave or broken enough to dig it up again. The following week brought a rare stillness to the swamp. The air hung low and silver, and the smell of cane smoke drifted faintly through the evening. At Calhoun Manor, the lamps burned brighter than usual, their glow spilling across the veranda as laughter and music rose from within. Jonas Calhoun was hosting supper for the neighboring planters, a gathering meant to remind Fairwater Parish that he still belonged among them. The guests arrived in pairs, dressed in linen and arrogance, their carriages lined up along the muddy drive like a parade of ghosts. Inside the dining hall, The air shimmered with the heat of candles and brandy. Silverware clinked against porcelain, and the men's voices grew louder with every refill of wine. They spoke of crops and profit, of sugar yields and the endless burden of labor. But their talk soon turned to the subject that had brought them the most amusement, the old man. Someone lifted a glass and called him by name, the one word spoken with mock reverence. Virgil. They toasted to him, to the foolishness of buying bones when there was still flesh for sale. The fool who bought a corpse, one man said, and the others laughed until their faces went red. The sound rolled through the hall, echoing off the high ceiling like thunder too close to home. Outside, the night had deepened to a shade of black that swallowed light whole. The cypress trees leaned inward, their branches dripping with moss that moved like the breath of something alive. From beyond the window, faint and steady, came a sound, the same low hum that had haunted the nights since Virgil's arrival. It slipped through the cracks in the shutters, wrapping itself around the laughter until the room seemed to shiver. One of the women at the table looked toward the window, frowning. The candles flickered, their flames bending sideways as though pulled by an invisible tide. The laughter faltered but did not stop. They blamed the draft, poured another round, and raised their glasses again. But the hum grew louder, not angry, not fast, just relentless. The dogs outside began to whine. The air thickened, the temperature dropping until the men's breath fogged faintly in the candlelight. The plantation workers in the yard stood still, listening. They knew that tune. It was not new. It was older than the swamp, older than the parish, older than the language spoken inside that dining room. Then, as quickly as it had come, the sound stopped. The night fell silent, except for the creak of the floorboards and the faint drip of melted wax. The laughter did not return. No one spoke for several long moments. The guests looked to their host, but Jonas Calhoun said nothing. His eyes lingered on the window where the curtain swayed though the wind had died. When the meal ended, the guests left early. Some claimed the air had gone foul, others that the ground felt unsteady beneath their boots. The servants closed the shutters tight, whispering prayers as they moved through the empty hall. And outside, where the lanterns guttered in the damp air, Virgil walked slowly past the window, humming again, the same tune, the same rhythm, steady and cold. The candles inside flared once more, shadows dancing across the walls like figures trying to escape their forms. By morning, the laughter that had filled Calhoun Manor had vanished. What replaced it was silence so thick it pressed against the walls. The men who had mocked him rode home uneasy, though none would admit it aloud. But every one of them, when passing through the fog on the road out of Cypress Hollow, swore they heard a hum behind them, rising from the fields, they sabrication, carrying on the wind, like the memory of their own voices coming back to haunt them. The morning after the supper at Calhoun Manor dawned gray and wet, the air swollen with mist that clung to the cane fields, like breath held too long. The first workers to step outside noticed it immediately. The rows of sugar cane, usually neat and uniform, were wrong. The stalks that should have stood tall and straight were bent, leaning away from the old man's cabin as if the plants themselves feared him. The soil around his quarters had darkened overnight, slick with moisture though it had not rained. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron, and the sound of the swamp, frogs, insects, the slow heartbeat of the river had fallen silent. When the overseer arrived, his temper already sharp from lack of sleep, he blamed the workers for neglecting the fields, but even he paused when he saw what lay before him. The cane rows had split down the center, forming a narrow path that stretched from the edge of the quarters toward the river, as if something had moved through during the night, and the plants had bent aside to make way. The stalks on either side trembled in the faint wind, their leaves whispering together in a rhythm that sounded too much like speech. Closer inspection brought worse discoveries. On the lower trunks of the cane, faint markings had been carved not with a blade, but pressed into the surface as though the stalks had softened to receive them. Circles within circles, spiraling inward like ripples frozen in water. The workers crossed themselves, whispering that such signs were never meant for the living to read. When the overseer scraped one with his knife, sap bled from it like tears, thick and red as rust. Jonas Calhoun was called to see for himself. He studied the field in silence, his face unreadable. The symbols meant nothing to him, yet something about their precision unsettled him deeply. He ordered the men to cut down every marked stalk and burn them in the far pit behind the stables. The workers obeyed, though none wanted to touch the cane. As the fire took hold, a sound rose from the pit, not crackling, but a hiss, low and steady, like a whisper escaping through teeth. The smell was unbearable, sweet and rotting at once. By evening the ashes were buried, and the fields appeared untouched again. The overseer drank himself into a stupor, muttering that the land was cursed, while Calhoun stood on the veranda watching the last light fade from the sky. He told himself that he had restored order, that superstition had no place in his household. But the peace was short-lived. When the workers returned to the fields at dusk to close the gates, the path had returned. The cane stood split again, the same stalks bending in the same direction. And this time the symbols were not just on the trunks, they stretched across the soil itself, drawn with ash and sap in long, sweeping arcs that curved toward the old man's cabin. In the center of one circle lay a small object half buried in the dirt, a piece of iron blackened and cold, shaped like a shackle broken clean in two. The workers fled the field, whispering prayers into their hands. From the porch, Calhoun saw the movement in the distance, the faint glint of metal catching the dying light. He felt a chill slide through him, a memory he could not name rising from somewhere deep within the earth. Behind him, the house groaned softly, the timbers shifting as if exhaling. And far across the fields, where the cane bowed low, a figure moved between the rows, slow and deliberate, humming a tune that had no end. That night, the mist returned, heavier than before. The dogs howled once, then fell silent. When the first thunder rolled across Cypress Hollow, every flame in the manor flickered at once, and the fields outside seemed to sway not with the wind, but with breath. The warnings were written plainly now, not for the eyes but for the soul, and the land had begun to speak in a language no man could silence. The sun rose red over Cypress Hollow, the kind of dawn that carried the scent of warning. The air was thick enough to drink, and even the birds stayed hidden in the trees. The workers began their day in silence, eyes lowered, the sound of machetes cutting through cane like soft, rhythmic prayer. They could feel the storm that wasn't in the sky but in the man who walked the fields with a coiled whip at his side. Thaddeus Pike had not slept. The night before, he had seen things he refused to name, shapes moving between the rows, lights flickering where no lanterns burned. He blamed the old man for it all. Every whisper, every chill in the wind, every nightmare that woke him drenched in sweat had a name, and that name was Virgil. By mid-morning, Pike's temper had found its breaking point. A tool misplaced, a delay in the harvest, small offenses that became excuses for cruelty. He stormed toward the quarters, whip in hand, eyes wild from drink and fear. The workers scattered, pretending not to see what was coming. Only the old man remained still, sitting by the cabin door, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the mist hung low. Pike barked orders, no one answered. The sound of his boots on the dry earth was the only thing that dared move. When he stopped in front of Virgil, the world seemed to pause with him. The lash fell once, splitting the quiet. The sound echoed across the yard, sharp and clean, cutting through the morning like a bell announcing judgment. The workers turned away, but none covered their ears. They waited for the second strike, for the cry that never came. Virgil didn't move. His body absorbed the blow like earth taking rain. Pike hesitated, confused, his hand trembling though he refused to admit it. He raised the whip again, but before it fell, Virgil spoke. No one would ever agree on what he said. Some claimed it was words too old to be English. Others swore it was their own names whispered back at them, one by one. Whatever the sound was, it made the overseer's face drain of color. His arm dropped to his side. The whip slid from his hand and lay coiled at his feet. For a long moment he just stared at the old man, his breath ragged, the veins in his neck pulsing like something trapped inside him was trying to get out. Then he turned and walked away, saying nothing, his boots leaving dark prints in the dust. That night, the storm finally came. The rain started without warning, sheets of water falling so hard it drowned the usual chorus of frogs and crickets. The workers huddled in their quarters, whispering prayers to drown out the wind. Through the noise, a single voice broke Pike's voice, shouting from the fields. At first it was the sound of rage, the same booming tone they had learned to fear. But it changed quickly, turning to something higher, desperate, the sound of a man calling for mercy. It echoed once, then again, then stopped. When morning came, the rain had washed the air clean but left the land uneasy. The fields looked freshly plowed, though no one had worked them. The cane rows where Pike's screams had come from were flattened in a perfect circle, the stalks bent outward like fingers pointing away from the center. His whip was found there, half buried in mud. The handle cracked and darkened as if burned. No trace of Thaddeus Pike remained. Not his hat, not his boots, not his shadow. Jonas Calhoun said nothing. He stood at the edge of the field, eyes narrowed, the wind tugging at his coat. The workers waited for orders, but none came. Somewhere deep in the cane, a low hum began again, faint but steady, pulsing beneath the soil. It was not the sound of mourning. It was the sound of the earth remembering, and Cypress Hollow had begun to take back what it was owed. The river behind Calhoun Manor was older than the parish itself. It wound through the swamp like a slow vein of memory, carrying secrets in its dark current. It had watched empires rise and rot. It had drunk blood from battlefields and swallowed names long before anyone carved them into headstones. The people of Cypress Hollow feared the river at night. They said it never truly slept, that it whispered when the moon was gone, that the current sometimes ran backward when something below stirred. But Jonas Calhoun had always dismissed such talk as superstition until the morning he saw Virgil kneeling on its banks. The fog was still thick when Jonas rode out, hoping the quiet of the swamp would settle the unease that had been growing inside him since the overseer's disappearance. The land had not felt right since that night. The air was heavier, the shadows longer, and the sound of hammering sometimes rose from nowhere in the distance. He told himself it was just the workers repairing the mill, but he knew it wasn't. There was no work being done in those hours. There was only the echo of something that should not still exist. As he neared the river, the morning light caught on something that moved against it. The current was slow, but the ripples near the far bend were traveling upstream, sliding over the surface like breath pushing through water. And there, on the bank, was the old man. Virgil was on his knees, his hands resting on the edge of the river as though he were feeling its pulse. His head was bowed, lips moving in a whisper so soft that even the wind dared not interrupt. Jonas dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet clay, and felt an unfamiliar tremor in his chest. For a long moment, he watched in silence. The river seemed to listen too. Each time the old man spoke, the water responded, curling inward in small spirals before smoothing again. It was like watching a conversation that the living were not meant to hear. Jonas wanted to call out, to remind the man that he was master here, but his throat refused to obey. There was something about the scene that felt sacred and wrong at the same time. When Virgil finally looked up, his eyes caught the weak sunlight and reflected it like glass. His face was calm, but his voice carried weight when he spoke. He said that every soul this land had taken still waited for an answer. The words were neither threat nor prayer. They were a truth delivered without emotion, a truth that sank into Jonas's mind like a stone falling through water. For the rest of the day, he could not shake the image. He tried to convince himself that it was madness, that the current had always played tricks in the bends of the river. But when he returned at dusk, he saw the same ripples running the wrong way, the same steady pull of the water defying its source. He dipped his hand into it, and the chill ran up his arm to his chest. Beneath the surface, he thought he felt movement, not fish, not driftwood, but the faint brush of something larger, something that recoiled and then returned. The workers refused to go near the river after sunset. They said it whispered names in the dark, names no one had spoken for years. Some of them woke from dreams of drowning with those same names caught in their throats. And Jonas Calhoun, the man who ruled this land by law and deed, began to feel himself shrinking beneath its weight. The soil, the cane, the water, all of it seemed to know something he did not. That night, as the moon rose pale over Cypress Hollow, Jonas sat alone on the veranda and listened. From somewhere in the distance came a low, familiar hum, the same rhythm that had haunted his sleep. The river answered it softly, its surface trembling in time. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, he wondered if he had bought not a man but the past itself. The nights at Calhoun Manor had always been thick and restless, but that summer they became unbearable. The heat no longer came from the air, but from the ground itself. It began quietly, with the servants complaining that the floors felt warm under their bare feet as they swept before dawn. At first, Jonas dismissed it as imagination, a trick of humidity and sleepless nerves. But within days, the warmth grew into something more deliberate. The boards creaked at night as if they were breathing, and a faint, acrid scent, part earth, part ash, rose through the cracks. The servants began to whisper about it, saying the house was sick. One claimed she saw smoke curling up from the floorboards in the hallway outside the parlor. Another swore that when she knelt to scrub the boards, the heat pulsed like a heartbeat beneath her palms. The whispers spread quickly through the manor and into the quarters, where they grew into stories about the land burning from within, the ground remembering the bodies it had swallowed. No one wanted to walk barefoot anymore. Even the dogs refused to cross the front steps after sunset. Jonas Calhoun tried to ignore it, but the evidence mounted. One night, woken by the smell of something burning, he descended the stairs to find the air thick with smoke that had no source. The fireplaces were cold, the lamps extinguished, yet thin ribbons of gray drifted upward through the seams between the planks. The boards themselves glowed faintly in the lamplight, as though embers had been buried beneath them. He ordered the servants to fetch water, but when they poured it, the liquid hissed and vanished before it touched the wood. The next morning, desperate for reason, Jonas ordered a section of the parlor floor to be torn up. The workers hesitated, muttering prayers, but obeyed. When they pried up the first plank, the smell hit them hot metal and wet soil, like the forge of a blacksmith left smoldering underground. Beneath the floor lay a layer of blackened earth, fine as powder and warm enough to make their tools steam when they touched it. And in the center, buried halfway into the dirt, was a chain. It was old, the links fused together by heat, its metal darkened almost to pitch. At first Jonas thought it was part of the foundation, some remnant of the house's early construction, until he realized that the chain went deeper than any foundation should. The men tried to pull it free, but it would not move. The earth seemed to grip it like a fist. One link bore a faint engraving, a pattern worn almost smooth, a circle within a circle, the same symbol that had appeared in the cane fields. The workers backed away, crossing themselves, refusing to touch it again. Jonas stared at the exposed earth long after the others left. The heat rising from it felt unnatural, alive. When he leaned closer, he thought he could hear something beneath the soil, a sound too rhythmic to be imagination, the dull ring of metal against metal, echoing from far below. He ordered the planks replaced before nightfall, though the sound continued after the floor was sealed again, faint but steady, pulsing beneath his feet whenever he walked through the room. That night no one slept. The walls groaned as though the house were shifting on its bones, and the air carried the smell of burnt iron. The servants swore they heard voices in the smoke, whispering from under the floor, calling names they could not recognize. By dawn, the air had cooled again, and the floor was silent. But when the first light touched the parlor, a thin line of soot marked every crack between the boards, tracing the shape of the chain buried beneath. The house itself had begun to breathe, and the land beneath it was waking up. By late August, word had begun to travel beyond the borders of Fairwater Parish. Strange rumors floated down the riverboats and through the markets, rumors of fire beneath the ground, of fields that leaned away from their master's house, of a man too old to die. Such talk eventually reached the small town of Amite, where a traveling preacher named Reverend Silas Ward took it upon himself to investigate. He was a stern man, one who believed sin could take root in soil as easily as in the soul. and he carried his Bible like a weapon sharpened by years of thunderous sermons. When he declared from his pulpit that he had felt a stirring of the devil near Cypress Hollow, a hush fell over his congregation. By the next sunrise, he was already on the road toward the Calhoun estate. The preacher arrived in the late morning, his boots caked with red clay, his eyes restless beneath the brim of his hat. The land itself seemed to resist him. The air grew thicker the closer he came, the birds quieter, the sunlight dimmer beneath the moss-draped trees. He had been to many plantations in his time, and he knew the smell of rot and sin well, but something about Cypress Hollow felt different. It was not decay he sensed, but awareness, as if the ground were listening to his footsteps. When the manor finally came into view, its white columns stained yellow by years of damp heat, he noticed the chapel standing apart from the main grounds, an old wooden building, small and leaning slightly, its doors open, though no one was inside. The workers watched him pass without a word. Their faces were blank, but their eyes carried a warning he could not read. He mistook their silence for guilt. Clutching his Bible tighter, he strode toward the chapel, determined to root out whatever darkness had taken hold there. The door creaked as he entered, and the air inside was thick and still, scented faintly with wax and something metallic. Dust motes floated in the sunlight that poured through the cracks, giving the space a strange golden haze. He called out, half expecting the echo of his own voice. But what answered was a low, steady murmur. At first, he thought the sound came from the wind moving through the boards. Then he realized it was a voice, an old voice, deep and slow, shaped by a cadence older than any sermon he had ever heard. The preacher stepped forward and froze. Standing at the front of the chapel was a figure, back turned, head slightly bowed. It was the old man, Virgil. His hands were clasped behind him, and his lips moved in rhythm with words the preacher could not understand. There was no congregation, no sound of footsteps, yet the pews seemed full of presence, the air heavy with unseen witnesses. The preacher's first instinct was to speak, to command the man to stop, to drive whatever unholy spirit was speaking through him out into the swamp. But his throat locked tight. The old man turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough for the preacher to see his profile in the fractured light. Virgil's eyes caught the beam like mirrors, and for an instant, Reverend Ward thought he saw faces within them, many faces, some screaming, others silent, all drowned in shadow. The preacher stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His Bible slipped from his grasp and fell open on the floor, pages fluttering in the still air. When he reached the doorway, he swore he heard more voices joining the old man's hum. Dozens of them, faint but unmistakable, layered like echoes of the same name spoken by 1,000 tongues. He ran without looking back, through the yard and into the trees, muttering prayers that dissolved into panic. By the time he reached his horse, the air had gone quiet again, and the river wind carried nothing but the scent of wet earth. He did not return to Amite until nightfall, mud-streaked and pale, refusing to speak of what he had seen. The next morning, one of the servants found his Bible lying open at the front of the chapel, its pages blackened around the edges, the words of the book of Exodus smeared into ash. The workers buried it behind the chapel without permission. They did not tell Calhoun. Some things, they decided, were safer left between the living and the land that watched them. And though the preacher never came back, those who lived at Cypress Hollow would later say that on certain evenings, when the air grew thick and gold and the chapel stood empty, they could still hear the faint murmur of his prayers drifting through the open door, pleas for mercy that the earth never answered. By September, the whispers had left Cypress Hollow and spread through all of Fairwater Parish like wind carrying smoke. What began as quiet gossip among the field hands and kitchen servants soon found its way into the parlors and taverns, where the planters sat with their brandy and fear. The strange heat that had risen beneath Calhoun Manor, the marks in the fields, the preacher who had fled babbling about demons, these were not things the proud men of Fairwater could ignore. Yet they tried, laughing it off the way men laugh when their courage begins to slip away. They called it hysteria. They said the swamp played tricks on weak minds, But the laughter died the week death came for two of their own. The first was Everett Braithwaite, a man whose mouth had rarely been empty of mockery since the day Jonas Calhoun bought the old slave. He had been the loudest voice at that dinner weeks earlier, the one who raised his glass and toasted the fool who bought a corpse. On a Monday afternoon, as he rode home from inspecting his fields, the sky turned strange. Clouds gathered faster than nature allowed, thick and swirling in silence. No thunder to warn of what was coming. A single bolt of lightning fell, white and clean, striking him square in the chest. The horse returned to his house, riderless, reins smoking. His body was found in the road, his clothes unburned, but his heart stopped cold. The second was Silas Greeley, another of the men who had laughed loudest that night at Calhoun's expense. He was found 3 days later at the bottom of his estate's well, his body floating in water that did not exist the day before. The well had been dry for years, its stones cracked and dust-filled, yet somehow he had drowned there, his hands clawing at the sides as if trying to climb out of something deeper than earth. The doctor who examined him fainted at the sight. The parish sheriff closed the well and told everyone to keep silent. Fairwater Parish is a place where silence breeds superstition. Within days the people began to speak of curses, of old sins unearthed. Some said Jonas Calhoun had made a pact, that he had traded something holy for his fortune, and now the debt had come due. Others whispered that the old man he brought from Fairwater's auction block was not a man at all, but something that had learned to wear skin the way a snake wears scales. Those who worked the river claimed they saw strange lights drifting above Cypress Hollow at night, blue and white, flickering like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Jonas heard these stories, though few dared speak them to his face. He told himself they were nothing but fear, inventing reason. Yet even he could not explain what was happening to his land. The air around the manor had grown heavy, thick with the smell of rain, though no storm came. The sugar cane wilted at the edges, their leaves curling inward like fists. The birds avoided the fields, flying wide arcs around the property. When Everett Braithwaite was buried, the sky above the church stayed dark, though the day was clear everywhere else. When Silas Greeley's coffin was lowered, the water in the river turned black for half a mile downstream. The preacher who conducted the service read from the Psalms with a voice that trembled, and when he closed his Bible he did not look toward the direction of Cypress Hollow. By the end of the week, no one in Fairwater Parish laughed about Jonas Calhoun anymore. Carriages began to take longer routes to avoid his land. The postriders stopped delivering letters past sundown. Children were told not to speak his name after dark, as if the syllables themselves could call something listening in the fields. In the quiet of his house, Jonas sat alone, staring at the single candle that refused to stay lit. Each time the flame faltered, he thought of Virgil's words by the river of souls, waiting for an answer, and for the first time, he wondered if the earth itself had decided to reply. Autumn came to Cypress Hollow with no wind. The air was thick, the leaves hung unmoving, and the nights grew heavy with a stillness that felt wrong. Even the frogs, loudest creatures of the swamp, fell silent after sunset. Yet within that silence, another sound began to rise. It started faintly, like a pulse beneath the earth, a rhythm too steady to belong to nature. Then, one night, the workers heard it clearly. The ring of a hammer striking metal. At first, they thought it was memory, an echo from some distant forge across the river. But as the sound deepened, they realized it came from within their own land, from the small shed behind the old man's cabin. Virgil had begun forging again. No one had seen him light a fire. There was no smoke, no glow leaking from the cracks, and yet the hammer fell in perfect measure, slow, patient, relentless. It rang through the swamp and into the hearts of all who heard it. The rhythm was unlike the hammering of any blacksmith. It was deliberate, like a prayer spoken in metal. The sound carried for miles, vibrating through the ground and up the legs of those who dared walk near. Even inside the manor, Jonas Calhoun could feel it faintly beneath his feet, a steady thud that never changed pace, as though the old man had found the heartbeat of the land and matched it strike for strike. Curiosity soon turned to fear. Those who worked near the forge claimed they heard more than metal. They said that if you stood still long enough, You could hear voices singing within the ringing, soft at first, then clearer men's voices, deep and sorrowful, blending with the hammer's fall. Some swore the words were not English, not any language they knew, but every syllable carried the weight of mourning. A few of the younger workers covered their ears and refused to go near the cabin again. The overseer was gone, and no one dared take his place. By the third night, the sound grew stronger. The cane leaves trembled with each strike, and the river's current began to move in rhythm. The animals grew restless. The dogs howled once and then went silent, tails tucked, refusing to approach the forge. From the porch of the manor, Jonas watched the faint shimmer of heat rise above the shed, though there was no firelight. He wanted to order the old man to stop, but something in him hesitated. The sound was hypnotic, ancient, commanding. Each strike seemed to pull at something deep inside him, something buried and long ignored. The following morning, when the hammer fell silent, the workers approached the forge cautiously. The air around it still quivered with warmth. Inside, they found shapes upon the table, twisted pieces of metal that caught the light but revealed no purpose. Some were curved like ribs, others thin and straight like bones. None were tools, at least not tools for men. When Jonas held one in his hand, it pulsed faintly, warm as blood, and left a black smear on his skin that would not wash away. That night, the hammering began again, slower this time, deeper. The sound no longer echoed through the swamp, it came from beneath it. Those who lay awake swore they could hear the ground answering back, another rhythm rising from below. Between the two beats, a harmony formed metal and earth, life and death, calling to each other through time. In the days that followed, the fields grew strange. The cane that bordered the forge bent inward, bowing as though in reverence. The soil beneath it turned dark and rich, the same color as the old man's hands. At dusk, the river seemed to shimmer with reflected fire, though no flame burned along its banks. And every night, as the hammer's hymn rolled through Cypress Hollow, the people whispered the same thing to one another. They said the old man was not making iron, he was remaking memory. Each strike was a name, each spark a soul, and when the song was finished, the land itself would remember everything it had been forced to forget. The boy was no more than 10, thin as a reed, his skin the color of the mud he played in when no one watched. He had been born on Calhoun land, too young to remember a world beyond the cane fields. His nights were usually filled with the small mercies of exhaustion and dreamless sleep, but one evening, he woke screaming. His voice carried across the quarters, high and sharp, cutting through the chorus of insects that had finally returned to the swamp after weeks of silence. The others tried to soothe him, but the boy's eyes were wide, fixed on something only he could see. When he found his breath, he whispered that he had seen men walking out of the cane. The adults told him to hush, told him the swamp played tricks in the dark, but the boy insisted. He said they were not men like the ones in the fields. Their faces were burned, their eyes hollow, and their mouths moved without sound. Chains trailed from their wrists, dragging behind them and sinking into the soil as they walked. He swore they moved toward the cabin of the old man, their steps slow and heavy, their bodies glowing faintly in the mist like embers that refused to die. He said Virgil had been waiting for them. He had seen the old man standing at the edge of the field, not afraid, not surprised, but expectant, as if welcoming long-forgotten friends. And then Virgil spoke to them, calling each by name, though no one could have known those names anymore. By morning, the story had spread across the quarters. The workers whispered as they went about their chores, avoiding the cane rows near Virgil's cabin. Even the bravest among them would not look toward that side of the field after sunset. Jonas Calhoun heard the rumor from one of the house servants, who tried to laugh as she repeated it, though her hands trembled as she poured his coffee. He dismissed it, as he dismissed all such tales, but the unease in her eyes lingered with him long after she left the room. That night, the sky refused to clear. Clouds gathered low, trapping the heat close to the earth. Jonas lay awake, the windows open, the scent of sugar and smoke drifting in from the fields. Somewhere in the distance, he heard it again, the faint ring of metal, the slow rhythm of hammer against iron. It pulsed through the air, steady and patient, and with it came the echo of voices, too soft to understand. Sleep came to him only when the sound finally faded, but it brought no rest. In his dream, the fields were burning. The cane glowed red, swaying like waves of fire without flame. From between the rows came figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, men and women walking with the slow, inevitable movement of the tide. Their faces were blurred by heat, their hands bound by rusted chains that clattered as they moved. The air was heavy with ash, and yet the sound that rose above it was not screaming but a kind of chanting, low and mournful, shaped by voices that carried the weight of centuries. He saw Virgil standing at the center of the field, his arms raised, his face lifted toward the smoke-filled sky. The figures surrounded him, their chains breaking one by one, the sound ringing out like the toll of distant bells. Jonas tried to call out, but no sound came. The ground beneath him rippled, softening like mud after rain, pulling at his boots, dragging him downward. As the soil swallowed his feet, one of the figures turned toward him, its eyes empty yet familiar. The lips moved, and though he heard no voice, he understood the word it spoke his name. Jonas woke drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The room was dark, but the scent of iron and smoke lingered, real and unmistakable. When he looked toward the window, he thought he saw movement in the fields, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The cane swayed, though there was no wind. For a long moment, he could not breathe. The boy's dream, he realized, was not a child's fancy. It was a message. And now, it had found its way into his own sleep. Outside, the hum began again, rising from the fields like a heartbeat returning to life. The earth of Cypress Hollow had begun to remember its dead, and its master could no longer pretend not to hear. For 3 days after the storm, the swamp remained silent. The workers refused to go near the river, and even the wind seemed to avoid it. Something had changed in the air around Cypress Hollow, something that made the skin prickle and the heart race without reason. The smell of damp soil hung thick, metallic and sweet, as though the rain had unearthed things that should have stayed buried. No one mentioned Thaddeus Pike's name, but everyone thought of him. The overseer had vanished during the storm, his screams carried into the night and swallowed by the thunder. The cane fields had been searched in daylight, though the men moved reluctantly, glancing over their shoulders with every step. They found no trace of him then. But on the third morning, the river answered. It was one of the ferrymen who discovered him first, though he never spoke of it aloud. The man was bringing his skiff along the bend when he saw what he thought was a scarecrow planted at the edge of the bank. As he drew closer, the shape took form, a man standing upright in the mud, motionless, facing the water. The ferryman froze where he stood, the oar slipping from his hand. The figure did not sway with the wind or sink into the current. It stood perfectly still, half buried up to the knees, as though the river itself had decided to keep him. By the time the word reached the manor, the news had already twisted into legend. Jonas Calhoun rode down to the river with 2 of his men, though neither wanted to approach. The closer they came, the stronger the stench of wet ash and decay grew, burning the throat and stinging the eyes. When they finally saw the body, the sight robbed them of speech. Thaddeus Pike was there, standing in the shallows, his eyes wide open and pale as glass. His skin had turned the color of clay, his lips drawn back over his teeth in what might have been a smile if not for what filled his mouth. Packed tightly between his teeth and across his tongue was a thick paste of gray ash, damp and glistening in the light. It dripped from his chin into the water, spreading in slow, dark ribbons that dissolved into the current. One of the men muttered a prayer, another retched into the grass. Jonas said nothing. His gaze drifted down to the mud around Pike's feet. There were no footprints leading in or out. No sign that anyone or anything had placed him there. The river had simply lifted him up from its depths and set him where it wanted. When they tried to pull him free, the earth resisted, clinging to him as though unwilling to release its claim. That evening, when the workers gathered near the quarters, Virgil was seen standing at the edge of the field. He was looking toward the river, his face unreadable. Someone asked softly what had happened to Pike. What kind of punishment could twist a man that way? The old man spoke without turning his head. He said the earth had taken back what it lent. His voice was calm, not cruel, but final, like a sentence being read aloud. After that, the river became a thing no one crossed after dark. The ferrymen refused to work past sundown, and the workers began to mark its edge with salt and crushed herbs, small offerings to whatever power ruled its depths. The water itself seemed changed. It no longer reflected the moon clearly. Instead, it shimmered with a dull, uneven glow, as though something beneath it was moving. Jonas lay awake that night, hearing the river from his window. It had never sounded so loud. The current gurgled and hissed, and now and then he could swear he heard a faint clinking, like chains dragged along stone. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pike's body standing in the mud, his open eyes staring into nothing. By dawn, mist covered the fields again. The workers whispered that the river had claimed a voice it had been waiting for. They said the earth was remembering every hand that had struck it, every lash that had fallen across its children. And when they looked toward Virgil's cabin, they swore they saw the old man watching the sunrise, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps in gratitude. Whatever peace had once existed in Cypress Hollow was gone. The land had begun to judge its own. The first sound came just as the sun slipped below the cypress trees, a thin thread of noise carried by the wind. At first it was so soft that most thought it was only the river shifting, or the rustle of cane brushing together in the evening breeze. But as the light bled from the sky and the swamp turned to shadow, the sound grew clearer. It was not the cry of an animal, not the whistle of the wind through branches. It was laughter. It began faintly, a single voice that rose and fell with the wind, drifting across the fields in a way that made it impossible to tell where it came from. The enslaved workers were the first to notice. They stopped where they stood, their tools hanging limp in their hands, eyes darting toward the horizon. Some said the sound came from the cane rows. Others swore it echoed from beneath the earth itself. Then more voices joined in, layer upon layer, until the air trembled with the sound of hundreds, laughing at once soft, rhythmic, and endless. Inside the manor, the candles flickered. The laughter seeped through the shutters like smoke, slipping beneath doors, winding down the halls. Jonas Calhoun froze at his desk, his quill poised above a ledger he could no longer read. The laughter had weight. It was not joy, nor mockery, but something older, heavier, a sound made by those who had nothing left to fear. He tried to convince himself that it was just the wind carrying echoes from the river, but each gust carried the laughter closer, louder, until the glass panes shivered in their frames. Out in the quarters, the workers huddled together, whispering prayers. Some pressed their palms to the ground, murmuring to the soil as if begging it for silence. The elders said it was the laughter of the dead, the ones who had died cutting cane, the ones buried without names. They said the land had begun to speak through them, that the souls trapped beneath Cypress Hollow had finally remembered how to breathe. The young ones wept quietly, clinging to each other, while the older men stood staring into the fields where the moonlight bent and rippled like heat. The laughter swelled until it was everywhere, rolling across the swamp, rising from the river, circling the house like a storm. The shutters banged against the walls, and the dogs barked once before retreating beneath the porch, tails pressed flat. In the kitchen, a servant dropped a tray, the sound lost in the chaos. The wind tore through the chimney, and for an instant, it carried voices inside. Between the bursts of laughter, there were words, faint and broken, a mixture of tongues long forgotten. It was a sound that did not belong to any living throat. Jonas covered his ears, but it made no difference. The sound was not outside, it was in the walls, in the floors, in the bones of the house itself. He stumbled through the dark, shouting for the servants to shutter the windows, to douse the lamps, but no one came. The house had gone still, save for that endless, rolling chorus. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Even the insects were quiet. Jonas stood alone in the dark, his breath ragged, the sweat cooling on his skin. He could hear the faint creak of the boards beneath him and, somewhere far off, a single echo of laughter fading into the distance. By dawn, the story had already spread. Those who lived near the parish road claimed they had heard it too, carried on the wind from miles away. The planters scoffed at the tale, calling it foolish superstition, though their eyes betrayed their unease. The enslaved people said otherwise. They said the laughter had been building for years, trapped beneath the weight of the land, and that night it had finally broken free. They said it was not a haunting, it was remembrance. And in Cypress Hollow, remembrance was far more dangerous than ghosts. It came without warning. One evening the air in Cypress Hollow simply stopped moving, as if the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. The frogs that croaked endlessly through the swamps fell silent first. Then the insects, the night birds, even the whisper of the river that had murmured for centuries. Within an hour, the plantation lay under a silence so complete it pressed against the chest like weight. It was not peace. It was waiting. The enslaved workers were the first to feel it. They sat in their quarters with their hands clasped, eyes wide, afraid even to whisper. The old women said the world only went that quiet once before the night the first chain touched the first neck on this land. Some began to hum softly, the oldest song they knew, but the sound died in their throats. It was as if the air itself refused to carry noise. The candles flickered but gave no warmth. The fields outside looked frozen in the pale light of the moon, each stalk of cane stiff and straight, the leaves unmoving despite the heavy humidity. In the manor, Jonas Calhoun woke from a shallow sleep, heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed him. For a moment he thought he had gone deaf. The stillness was suffocating. Even the ticking clock in the parlor had stopped, its pendulum hanging in mid-swing. He sat up, the sheets cold against his skin, and realized the silence was not absence but presence, something vast and listening. He lit a lamp with shaking hands and moved toward the window. The flame guttered weakly, its light trembling across the room, and in its flicker he saw the fields standing unnaturally still. Jonas tried to convince himself it was only a trick of exhaustion, the mind searching for pattern in darkness. But then he noticed it, the faintest tremor beneath the floorboards, like breath shifting through wood. It was slow and deep, the pulse of something sleeping just below. The sound of his own breathing became unbearable in the hush. He needed to hear something else, anything else. He stepped into the hall, calling out for the servants, his voice too loud in the still air. No one answered. When he reached the cabin where the old man slept, the door stood open. The single candle inside had burned itself out hours earlier, leaving behind a curl of smoke that hung motionless in the dark. Virgil's bed was empty, the sheets cold to the touch. The window was open, but the curtain did not stir. Jonas called his name once, twice, but the sound seemed swallowed before it left his mouth. Then he saw the chains. They lay coiled neatly on the floor at the foot of the bed, blackened links glinting in the lamplight. The iron was still warm. One end was fused into the shape of a circle, as though the metal had melted and reformed by its own will. It reminded Jonas of a serpent at rest, its body looped upon itself, patient and alive. He reached out, hesitating an inch above the metal. The heat coming from it was steady, rhythmic, almost like breath. He pulled back quickly, his fingers tingling. Outside, the stillness deepened. The moon hung directly above the cane fields, pale and sharp. From the river came no sound, not even the usual lapping of the current. It was as though every living thing in Cypress Hollow had agreed to hold its breath until something decided to exhale. Jonas stood in the doorway of the cabin, staring out into the field that stretched toward the horizon. The cane shimmered faintly in the moonlight, silvered and still, and just at the edge of sight, where the field met the swamp, he thought he saw movement, a figure standing between the rows, tall and motionless, the faint glint of metal at its feet. He blinked, and it was gone. Only the silence remained. Jonas stayed awake until dawn, though the night never changed. No wind rose, no bird called. When morning finally came, the world exhaled again. The frogs began their croaking, the insects their hum, and the river its endless murmur. Everything returned as if nothing had happened. But the air felt different now, emptier, older, like the echo of something that had just passed through. In the cabin, the chains remained, coiled perfectly, waiting. The workers would not go near them. They said the old man had not left. He had only gone deeper into the earth, into the river, into the memory of the land itself. And when the wind finally returned that evening, it carried with it not laughter, not song, but the faint sound of a hammer striking metal, far away and eternal. The night began like all the others that season, humid, uneasy, and full of the strange quiet that had settled over Cypress Hollow since Virgil's disappearance. But something different stirred in the air that evening. Something that felt deliberate. The dogs refused to leave their kennels, the wind carried no scent, and even the river sounded distant, as if retreating from what was coming. Jonas Calhoun sat alone in his study, a single candle flickering beside him. The flame burned with a steady, unnatural light, refusing to waver even when he opened a window to the swamp. Sometime after midnight, he noticed a glow outside, a thin, golden shimmer pulsing through the cane fields. It was not fire, not lantern light, but something softer, alive. The glow flickered in rhythm, like the beating of a heart. Jonas hesitated, torn between dread and curiosity, then took the candle from his desk and stepped outside. The night air was heavy, pressing close against his skin, and the world felt muffled, as though wrapped in cotton. The candlelight guided him along the narrow dirt path toward the fields, its flame bending toward the source of the glow. The deeper he went, the stranger the air became. The cane stood unnaturally straight, each stalk glimmering faintly as if coated in dew, though the ground beneath him was bone dry. The hum of insects had vanished again, leaving only the sound of his boots brushing through the leaves. Ahead, the light grew stronger, not scattered but gathered, forming a halo above a clearing in the middle of the field. Jonas slowed as he neared the edge, the candle trembling in his hand. There, under the open sky, stood every worker from the quarters. They were arranged in a perfect circle, motionless, their eyes wide and glistening white in the glow. None blinked, none swayed. It was as if the night itself held them upright. And in the center of that human ring stood Virgil. The old man's back was bent, but his presence filled the clearing. The candlelight caught the silver in his hair and the deep lines of his face, but his eyes were not the same, no longer clouded by age but clear and bright, reflecting the light that came from nowhere. His hands moved slowly in front of him, tracing symbols in the air. The sound began softly, a low hum that came not from his throat but from the ground itself. Then Virgil began to speak. The language was like nothing Jonas had ever heard. It was raw and heavy, each word vibrating through the air, shaking the leaves, rattling the bones in his chest. The earth responded with a deep groan, the soil trembling beneath their feet. Jonas watched as the candle in his hand flickered violently, its flame bending backward as if pushed by an invisible wind. The chanting grew louder, layered, as if more than one voice now spoke through the old man. The workers' bodies began to move in unison, not by will but by pull, their heads tilting upward, their mouths opening though no sound escaped them. The air thickened, swirling like smoke around the circle. Jonas could feel the vibration in his teeth, in his blood. The ground beneath them began to shift, rising and falling like the chest of something enormous breathing beneath the soil. He wanted to call out, to demand it stop, but his voice refused to form. He felt rooted, as if the earth itself gripped his ankles. In the faint, rippling light, he saw that the soil inside the circle had begun to crack, spreading outward in slow, deliberate lines. From the gaps seeped a dull red glow, the color of iron just before it cools. The air smelled of metal and rain, of things too old to name. Virgil's voice rose higher, no longer human, echoing from every direction at once. The cane bowed outward from the clearing, bending low as though in reverence. The workers began to sway, their white eyes reflecting the light from below. Then, with a sound like thunder buried beneath miles of stone. The earth gave a single, heavy shudder. The glow vanished. The air went still. The workers' eyes dimmed, and one by one they collapsed to their knees, gasping as if waking from a dream. At the center of it all, Virgil stood unmoving. The ground beneath his feet smoked faintly, and around him the cracks had sealed themselves shut. Jonas fell backward, trembling, his candle extinguished by a wind that came from the earth itself. When he looked up, the clearing was dark again. The circle had broken, and the workers stumbled away in silence. Only the faint scent of iron lingered in the air. The old man was gone. The place where he had stood was marked by a single shape in the dirt. A circle within a circle, pressed perfectly into the soil, still warm to the touch. And for the first time in his life, Jonas Calhoun understood that the land he ruled had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the memory of what it had taken. Jonas Calhoun woke before dawn, though the night had not truly ended. The world outside his window was gray and unmoving, and the mist that rolled over the fields looked thick enough to drown in. His body ached, but the pain was not of flesh, it came from somewhere deeper, something that had been pulled loose inside him since the circle in the cane. He had not slept properly in days, yet when his eyes did close, they did not grant him rest. They showed him things he did not wish to see. The first vision came like memory, but too vivid to be his own. He saw the fields of Cypress Hollow as they had been before him, before his father, before any Calhoun had drawn breath on this land. The cane was green and high, the sun bright, but the ground below it was red. He saw men and women working in the heat until their backs split open, their sweat mixing with blood that the soil drank without protest. He smelled iron and sugar and decay. He heard the whistle of whips and the dull thud of bodies falling. Then, as though a curtain had been torn away, he saw their faces, hundreds of them, some young, some impossibly old, all staring at him with eyes that asked a question he could not answer. The vision shifted. He saw the walls of his own house stripped of paint and plaster, revealing what lay beneath. Hands. Countless hands pressed into the wood, their outlines burned into it like brands. The sound of hammering filled his ears, sharp and relentless, echoing from everywhere at once. When he looked down, he realized his feet were sinking into the floor. The boards had turned to mud, thick and black, pulling him downward. Beneath the surface, shapes moved, bodies writhing slowly, buried together, their faces pale and open-mouthed, whispering in unison. He screamed for it to stop. The sound came out raw and jagged, tearing the air. He shouted until his throat felt scorched, but the visions only deepened. The house melted away, replaced by the fields again, endless and silent. Except now the cane grew from bones instead of soil. The stalks were white and brittle, and each one bore the mark of a scar, a lash frozen in its surface. He tried to look away, but every direction showed the same thing, every cruelty his family had ever wrought, every ounce of suffering that had bought their comfort. The past rose around him like a tide. Then the air shifted, thickening into heat. A figure stood before him, cloaked in shadow but unmistakable. Virgil's voice came from it, calm and ancient, cutting through the noise like a blade. "It's not punishment," the old man said. "It's remembering." The words struck him harder than the visions themselves. Remembering. The land was not seeking vengeance, it was calling back its truth, forcing those who had profited from its pain to see what it had endured. The fields were not cursed. They were awake. Every scream, every lash, every buried name had remained in the soil, and now they were surfacing, drawn by the rhythm of the hammer, by the chant in the cane, by Virgil's will. Jonas fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the dirt that now pulsed like flesh. He felt the heartbeat of the land, deep and slow, echoing through his bones. The sound carried every cry his family had silenced, every soul they had buried without prayer. It filled him until there was no space left for denial, until the weight of history pressed so heavy upon his chest he could barely breathe. When he lifted his head again, the vision began to fade, leaving behind the quiet dawn. The fields looked the same as before, green, still, and shimmering with dew. Yet he knew they were no longer what they seemed. Beneath that thin layer of calm lay the memory of everything done upon them, waiting to be remembered again. He did not move for a long time. The wind stirred faintly, and for an instant he thought he heard voices carried within it, soft and distant, singing something that might have once been a hymn. The sound was neither forgiveness nor condemnation. It was acknowledgement, the earth reclaiming its story, the past demanding to be seen. And Jonas Calhoun, for the first time in his life, understood that the soil beneath his feet was not his inheritance. It was his confession. The end began quietly. The day broke like any other in Cypress Hollow, with the heavy mist rising from the river and the sun trying in vain to pierce the veil. The workers woke early, but none spoke. They felt it before they saw it, the change in the air, the way the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, as if something vast and unseen were turning in its sleep. The birds did not sing. Even the insects, those eternal choristers of the swamp, had gone still. The silence pressed down on every living thing until it was hard to breathe. Jonas Calhoun stood on the veranda of the manor, staring at the horizon where the cane met the sky. A faint red glow shimmered there, unnatural and steady, as if the sun had decided to rise from the wrong direction. The color deepened with each passing minute, spreading across the clouds until the whole sky burned with a dull, molten light. The air smelled of iron and rain, but no storm followed. The earth beneath him groaned once, low and deep, and then again, louder. Closer. He felt the boards of the veranda shudder under his feet. Somewhere inside the house, a mirror fell and shattered, but the sound was swallowed before it could echo. The workers fled from the fields when the ground began to split. The first fissures appeared near the old chapel, long cracks that crawled through the soil and swallowed the roots of the cane. From the openings came a hiss, like steam escaping a forge, followed by the heavy scent of sulfur. The fields that had once fed the Calhoun estate began to collapse inward, the cane falling in waves as though pulled by invisible hands. The air shimmered with heat, though no fire burned. From deep within the swamp, the river began to boil, its surface bubbling as though something beneath it struggled to rise. Then came the sound of chains. It began faintly, far off. The faint metallic clatter of links dragged through water and mud. With every tremor of the earth, the sound grew louder, spreading across the parish until it seemed to come from every direction at once. The workers ran toward the road, clutching their children, their faces streaked with fear and sweat. Those who looked back swore they saw shapes moving within the red haze, figures walking through the collapsing fields, their forms shimmering like heat mirages, each one carrying the faint glint of iron at the wrists and ankles. The manor was the last to fall. The ground beneath it gave way all at once, as though some enormous mouth had opened below. The great white columns cracked, the roof folded inward, and the earth swallowed it whole in a single, shuddering motion. The sound was like thunder muffled by miles of water, the air filled with the scent of burning wood and wet ash, though no flame touched it. For a heartbeat, the house hung between ruin and silence, and then it was gone. Those who survived fled to the far edge of Fairwater Parish, too terrified to look back. But even from miles away, they saw the glow lingering over the swamp, pulsing like a dying star. They said the sky stayed red until morning, and that during the night the wind carried whispers through the trees. Some claimed they heard laughter, others weeping, but most spoke of a single voice, old, calm, and low, moving through the air like a current. The voice spoke only 2 words, carried clearly through the fields that no longer existed: balance restored. By dawn, nothing of Calhoun Manor remained. The land where it once stood was a crater of still water, reflecting the gray sky above. The river flowed backward for a time before finding its course again. No birds returned to the area, no crickets sang. The soil itself seemed to breathe in slow, steady rhythm, as if satisfied. The few who dared return years later said the cane never grew there again. The ground stayed damp, black, and rich, yet it rejected every seed. But when the wind blew across Cypress Hollow, the air carried the faint ring of iron like a hammer striking distant metal, and sometimes, just before sunset, The reflection of an old man's face would ripple across the water, smiling faintly, as if keeping watch over what had finally been made right. Years passed, and the name Cypress Hollow became more a rumor than a place. The maps still showed it, a stretch of land marked between river and swamp, but travelers who passed through Fairwater Parish learned not to ask for directions. The people who had lived there scattered across Louisiana, carrying pieces of the story with them like ash clinging to their clothes. No one spoke of what had really happened the night the earth split and the manor sank, but everyone knew better than to go near the hollow after dark. Where Calhoun Manor had once stood was nothing now but open ground. The foundation stones had vanished beneath a shallow pool that never drained, its surface black as oil. The cane never returned, no matter how many seeds the wind tried to carry. The soil remained rich, but refused to grow. Those who dared step barefoot upon it said the earth felt warm, even in the dead of winter, pulsing faintly as though something deep below still drew breath. The parish changed over the decades, but the hollow did not. Children born long after the fire and collapse were warned never to wander near the ruins. Hunters who strayed too far told stories of strange heat rising through their boots, of air that shimmered even under moonlight. Some swore they saw footprints in the mud that filled themselves again as soon as they formed. Others spoke of a faint ringing sound that came from beneath the water, like iron striking iron far below. But what the travelers remembered most was the laughter. It came on still nights, the ones with no wind and no sound from the river. At first, it was soft, barely a whisper, a trick of the reeds or the night birds. But as the darkness deepened, the laughter grew louder, fuller, echoing across the empty fields. It was not the laughter of cruelty or madness. It began gently, like the laughter of people freed from burden, rising and falling in waves. Yet those who listened too long said it changed near the end, curling into something colder, heavier. It became the kind of laughter that carried memory, the echo of joy that had learned what pain costs. Old men in Fairwater used to say that the laughter was the balance speaking, that it was the sound of every soul who had once bent beneath the weight of that land now rising again. They said the earth remembers everything done to it, and that some memories refuse to die. The laughter was not revenge. It was the echo of recognition. The land was simply telling the truth. As time went on, travelers gave the place a new name, the Field of Laughter. They avoided it when the sky reddened at dusk, but some swore that if you stood there alone, you could hear voices between the laughter, soft, measured, patient. One of them always sounded like an old man's, low and steady, whispering words that the wind carried only halfway. No one ever built there again. The ground stayed warm, and the grass that tried to root there withered by morning. And yet, on certain nights, when the moon hung full and red over the swamp, the sound returned, laughter rolling through the empty air, bright at first, then fading into something that made even the bravest men look over their shoulders. They said it was the land reminding anyone who would listen that nothing stays buried forever, that every cruelty leaves an echo, and every debt has its collector. And as the laughter faded into the distance, the final whisper always came with it, soft as breath and older than any prayer. Balance restored.